There were fewer SR-71 pilots than the number of astronauts who flew into space. We had the incredible opportunity to record the only complete interview of David Peters, a career Blackbird pilot and subject matter authority. He sadly did not live to see the completion of this video since he passed away on September of 2024 after a long battle with cancer. Join us in this detailed account to learn what it was like to fly recon missions in Vietnam, to pilot the incredible SR-71 Blackbird, and to be part of the Habu community.
I discovered my mother helped me write letters to, at that point in time, which was mostly Lockheed was there, I guess, and Sikorsky, Martin, and McDonnell Douglas. Well, they were McDonnell then, and Douglas was a separate one. And I found out that if you wrote them letters and told them that you were really interested in their airplanes, they would send you pictures of all of their airplanes. So I guess when I was about 8 or 9, my whole room, wall to wall, all 4 walls, was nothing but airplane pictures. And so that's where it really started, and it was a dream at that point. And then I went to college and Air Force ROTC, and I passed all of the tests and was qualified for pilot training and was accepted into advanced ROTC, and then that's where I got my private pilot's license. My flight time in ROTC was in Cessna 150, and that's where I got my private license in. And so then after graduation, accepted for pilot training, and I went to pilot training at Williams Air Force Base outside of Chandler, Arizona. And at that time, they were flying, they didn't have the T-41 or anything. They started you off in the T-37. And so I flew that and then went into the T-38. I was really lucky, I felt like, because the instructor that I had in T-37s was not an IP assigned as such. What he was a base ops officer, but he was what they call a guest IP. Herman Hines was the guy's name. The T-37 was the first airplane he'd ever flown with 2 engines in it, and he had over 6,000 hours. So you can imagine what he flew. And he was amazing. I mean, the guy could do stuff with an airplane that I don't know that I've ever flown with anybody since that could do. And so I really, really learned a lot. And I went from him to T-38s, and my instructor was a first class FAPE, as they call them, plowback instructor who just graduated from pilot training. And it ended up that he taught me some things and I taught him some things. And so it was really interesting. I enjoyed both of them. You can tell I ended up with a little over 4,200 hours in the T-38. So I really enjoyed flying that airplane. It was a really fun airplane to fly. And then after pilot training, I got RF-4Cs and went to training with them in Sumter, South Carolina, which was a true adventure, to say the least. I was born and raised in Tacoma, Washington, and I had never been, well, let's say Chandler was as far west as I'd ever been. And so I cruised into Sumter, South Carolina. This was in early 1966. And immediately found out that they had just passed compulsory education through the 6th grade. And so that kind of gives you an idea of where they were at. It was a totally different experience to me. never really seen anything like it. But it was really a lot of fun going through the school there. And then I went from there to Mountain Home, Idaho. And that was another interesting experience. I was a second lieutenant, and I was the first F4 guy on the base. And so when I went to sign in, I went to base housing to see about getting a house. And the master sergeant that was sitting behind the desk, he asked me what he could do for me. And I told him that I was there looking for a house. He says, well, what are you looking for? And I told him what my assignment was and everything. And he walked up to the desk and he took out some keys and he says, well, here's a map. Drive around. If you see something you like, come back and let me know. So my wife and I drove around, and we spotted this house that we really liked. So I went back, and he kind of looked at me funny when I told him what it was, and he said, oh, why not? So he gives me the key to it, and it was a 3-bedroom field grade house, and I ended up with it, which was kind of interesting. My first experience at living on base or anything like that. And that kind of correlates a little bit to my actually getting into the SR. The first time that I decided I was going to fly that airplane was when I was at Mountain Home flying RF-4s. And we had an airplane that had broken down and went into George Air Force Base in California. And they had repaired it, or so they said. It was there for quite a while. And I got sent down there with my backseater to ferry the airplane back home. And so we took off out of George and we're headed for Mountain Home. And the first thing I found out was I couldn't get fuel out of the wing tanks, or out of the externals. So I figured, well, I'd just go as far as I could go and try to figure out how to get it there. Well, it got to the point where I knew I wasn't going to make it to Mountain Home, and I ended up going into Navy Fallon in Nevada. So we landed, and we're taxiing in, and lo and behold, parked out on one of the taxiways, we're just out in the middle of nowhere, was this really strange-looking black airplane. And at that time, I was a first lieutenant, and my backseater was Lieutenant Colonel. He was a B-47, B-52 radar nav, so he'd been around a whole bunch. And I'm looking at this thing, and I said, Dick, what is that? Do you know? And he said, I don't have any idea because I've never seen anything like it. So we drive by it, and we go up to base ops, and I called back up to Mountain Home, to the squadron, and they asked me a bunch of questions, and they finally decided that I would be able to make it from there with internal fuel and not to worry about it. So then they'd fix the airplane when it got back rather than sending somebody to fix it there. So I told them I was okay with that, and so we fueled up, and we were taxiing out. Well, I learned much later that was actually one of the B models, and George Bull and John Story had a fuel problem and gone in there with it. And it was my first view of the SR-71. That was in '67. So we're taxiing out and taxi by that thing, and Dick says, what do you think about that thing? And I said, well, I have no idea what it is, but someday I'm going to fly it. The F-4 was, especially the RF-4, was really a fun airplane to fly. It was such a contrast with the SR-71 because I had some experience at supersonic at about 100 feet and supersonic 3 times at 90,000 feet. So there was a whole lot of difference in between. The RF-4C was designed to work in close areas for actual battlefield type information. We really did not do very much of anything in the terms of strategic reconnaissance. Tactical reconnaissance is to give the battlefield commander the information that he knows and needs around him to make decisions and fight the battles. And so that's what that was about. Strategic reconnaissance, on the other hand, is totally about national and political objectives. And so you're looking at a whole different kind of target and different kinds of surveillance. The RF-4 was really fun to fly, a good flying airplane, I thought. And it could cruise up. I actually got up to 2.2 Mach in it one time. And it was just really interesting to fly. But there was a whole lot of what we did in that airplane that was down in the dirt. Talking about Vietnam, some of the things that we did there were battlefield or battle damage assessment. And so we would go in to an area that had been struck and take different kinds of photographs so that they could assess what kind of damage was done, how effective was it. One of the really interesting missions that we flew quite a bit with both F-4s and 105s, and we would go and lead a flight of 4 go across first, and take all of the pictures that we could get. And then we'd pull up, follow them around, and after they went through, we would go back through and do their battle damage assessment. Those were interesting, and they had a low survival rate because obviously you had gone through and alerted everybody and then come back through after they were really pissed off. So we try, we didn't fly those too often, but we did, and it was really interesting. One of the things that I found interesting about it was on that first pass, you go through there and the Thuds would be right behind us. And by the time we got through and were accelerating out of the target area, we were pushing 600 to 650 knots. And those guys would go by us like we were tied to a post. I couldn't believe that airplane could go that fast on the deck, but they could. Then some of the other types of missions that we flew a lot of night stuff using both infrared sensors and photo flash cartridges. And they had different purposes. A lot of the stuff that we did with the photo flash was taking pictures of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, trying to catch where they had different truck parks, or if we caught them moving. That way they'd be able to send somebody in to do something about it. And one of the most interesting missions that I flew on that, I was actually flying a mission up above the DMZ and PAC-1. And I got a call from Waterboy, that was the area controller. And he says, "Hey, you got any gas?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "You have any ammo?" And I said, "No, but I could take a lot of pictures." And he says, "Oh, well, I got a mission for you." What they did was they had a truck, and some guys, F-4 guys out of Da Nang, were actually following the truck up Route 1. But they didn't have anything, they couldn't do anything about it. They were out. And so then they ran out of gas, so they were leaving it. And so he was interested in if I could track the guy to keep it, where he was, and keep them informed, because they were getting somebody to do something about it. And I said, "Yeah, we could do that. We've got plenty of gas, and if I had to go, land at Da Nang, I could do that." So we tracked up and we found the guy. He's cruising up Route 1, about 30 miles an hour. So we followed him for about 10 minutes, And I get a call back from the water boy, and he says, "Hey, I need you to call Green Forest on this frequency." And he gave me a frequency. So we said, okay. So we switched, called him up, and first thing he said was, "Do you have sight?" And I said, "Yep, we're tracking him." And he says, "What kind of coordinates can you give him?" Well, one of the things that was cool about the RF was we had a view sight and GPS, or inertial. And so we just flew over the top of the guy, and when he sat right in the middle of the view sight, my backseater gave him the coordinates off of the INS, which was not that bad. It was pretty accurate. And so he says, "Okay, we've got him. How fast is he traveling?" And we said, estimated about 30 miles an hour. So he said, "Well, you might want to move." And I said, "Okay, what do you got in mind?" He says, "Well, you might want to move inland, and you might want to climb up to about 5,000 feet. So I said, "Okay." So we went in, did that, sat there and tracked the guy and watched it. And we're waiting. We're going, "Okay, so what is this, and where are they? I'm not seeing anything." Just about that time, the truck and about 200 yards in every direction of the road disappeared. It flat went away. And I'm like, what on earth was that? And where did it come from? And I says, "Hey, Green Forest, who are you and where are you?" And he says, "Well, sir, we're known as the USS New Jersey. We're 26 miles offshore." They'd fired 3 16-inch guns at this clown, and they hit him dead center. You can imagine the result of that. But yeah, there was a whole lot of different. We did a whole lot of different things with the RFs. One of the big adventures, but one of the ones that you just really kind of wanted to stay away from, in your own mind at least, was flying up in Pac 6 and 5 and some of those, because survivability wasn't real high. When I went over there the first time, which was in mid '67, there were 12 of us, 6 crews that went over together on the same airplane, and we went to the same place. And when I got ready to come home, there were 2 of us left. So survivability wasn't a really good deal right then for that particular time frame. I never got hit, which was really, pretty fortunate. That the percentages were not good on that. But some of the, to be honest with you, some of the fun adventures were actually down flying in the Delta and flying to South Vietnam. I sank a sampan once with the RF-4. We were cruising along, doing what we called an area cover, which they just had a space that they wanted a lot of pictures of to see what they could find. And you flew a pattern where you would fly a line, do a 90 left, a 270 right, and that would, with some timing, at 360 knots or 420 knots, and that would give you an offset. And so you could cover the whole area. And so we're down there in the Delta, in the Mekong, and this guy just got on my bad nerve. They were in a sampan going down there, and he started shooting at us with a rifle. Never hit us. And my backseater, Dick Freeze, he goes, "I wish we could do something about him." And I said, "Well, Dick, I think we might be able to do that." So I went up on the river, let down, and got to where I was coming right at him at about probably 30 feet or so. Pushed it up and lit the burners, and you know the burners or the engines on an F4 are canted down, and so it didn't take much. Anywhere around 30 feet or so, you could start picking up a rooster tail like a unlimited hydroplane, only a lot bigger. So we went right across him, doing about 550 knots, and when we turned around, he wasn't there anymore, except for a bunch of pieces that were floating. So that's, if you can't shoot them, you run over them. They were still flying RF-101s out of Tonsonhoot. And I was flying a mission actually at Chapone, which is right there in the corners between Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And we were on our way back, and there was a really interesting place. It was a valley that stayed pretty calm, but you could usually find elephants down there. And so we thought we'd stop by there, you know, just cruise by and see if we could find something. So we were scooting down through there at about 100 feet on the radar altimeter, and never, you know, we saw some elephants, but not a whole lot. So we went on back and landed. I got a call from the photo guys, and they said, you might want to come down and look at this. And I said, okay, must be interesting. So went down there, and they had all the from our low pan camera, which was a real high speed camera. And so I was flying at that point about 460 knots at about 100 feet. And in 1.5 frames, there was a perfect picture of an RF-101 that was below me going the opposite direction. I never saw him. So their question was, exactly where were you and all of that kind of stuff. Then I had a little conference with the squadron commander too, but he thought it was pretty funny. So the tactics were quite a bit different, you know, with us than it was with the fighter guys, bomber type guys. A lot of what we were trying to do, there was a lot of really strange political stuff going on, especially through 67 and 68. And I don't know exactly how they did it, but they came up with some rules that were really goofy. They were not able to attack a SAM site unless they had pictures of it to prove it was there. So they would send us in trying to find the SAM site and get pictures of it so that they could authorize the fighter guys to go do something about it. I had one mission where we were doing that. 3 of us actually ended up trying to get pictures of the darn thing. And the reason that we were having trouble getting in was because they'd already shot down 3 airplanes. But they wouldn't allow them to attack it until they had pictures of it. So those, you know, there was a lot of things going on then that were politically not in our favor, and there were some really interesting things about it, like that. One of the ones that I guess is another one of those interesting stories. There was a fellow that I got to meet that he was actually a 105 pilot at the time. His name was Carl Richter, and Carl was a academy graduate. He was a first lieutenant at that time. He was the only authorized first lieutenant flight lead flying PAC-6. And he was my idea of Carl, knowing him, was he was a real young George Patton. He was a brilliant tactician, a great pilot, and he just was, everything that he did was to try to make things work right. And he came up with a brilliant idea to end the war. And he took it to the squadron commander, who thought it was a great idea, and he took it to his wing commander, who thought it was a great idea, who took it to some of the other command there in, he was flying out of Karat, I believe. Anyway, they finally ended up taking it all the way down to 7th Air Force. The plan was that they were going to take all of the available fighter bombers, F-4s, 105s, out of Thailand, and they were going to equip them all with 2,000-pound bombs, and they were going to do the same thing with all the available Navy resources out of the Gulf of Tonkin. And they were going to simultaneously attack the areas around Hanoi and Haiphong, the target being the dikes. His thoughts being on it, they take out the dikes, pretty much all of North Vietnam is going to be under 10 feet of water, and that makes it pretty hard to fight a war. Well, it went all the way up to Johnson, LBJ, and he shot it down because he said that it would not be humane. So that was the end of that great idea, which I still think to this day that it probably at that point would have ended that war, but overcome by politics. My second tour there, I was based at Tan Son Nhut. We had a guy that came in, he was a full colonel, and he was assigned to our squadron in order to fly and get his, let's call it a tour. And where he came from was he was LBJ's chief pilot on Air Force One. And he would get in the barracks, he'd get a call probably, I'm going to say maybe 2 to 3 times a week from LBJ, asking him how he was doing, what was going on, and all of that kind of stuff. And one of the things that I learned from kind of getting to be a little friendly with him and everything was that there were a lot of things that we did. I think he was trying to be, I don't want to say Patton, but maybe Dwight Eisenhower, in that he kept sending stuff down that he dreamed up as missions that we really needed to do. And he didn't know anything about ground, air, or sea. One example was for the RF-4s, somebody had seen helicopters crossing the DMZ real close to Dong Hoi. And it would be about 10 or 15 miles inland from the coast. And so they came up with this brilliant idea, and I was told that it was his idea, that they were going to send RF-4s out of Udorn and Tan Son Nhut. The guys out of Udorn would cross the point every half hour on the hour using photo flash cartridges, and they thought they might catch these guys and be able to take pictures of them. The guys out of Tan Son Nhut were going north and south doing the same thing. How long do you suppose it took before they shot one down? The third trip. How do you do that? You know, I just was not, I was not impressed with how he conducted all of that thing. It was kind of like if you've seen the right stuff when he got all bent out of shape about putting a monkey in orbit instead of a man. And I think that's just that was just kind of telling what his personality was and how he went about doing things. He was very self-important, and quite frankly, I don't think he had a clue what he was doing. That's my opinion. I guess that the wrap up for me in Vietnam became I had about 1,600 hours in the RF, and when it came time to go home for my last tour, I thought, boy, I love flying an airplane. I really like to do it. And so I heard that they were starting a squadron at Zweibrücken in Germany. And so I messed around until I finally was able to get a call through to Rated Officer Assignments. And I told them I was volunteering for consecutive overseas. I really like to go to that. They said, well, we've got you slated to go to T-38s. And I said, well, I really would like to go to that. And the guy says, well, we're only taking extremely experienced people for that. And I said, well, what is experience? I've got about 1,600 hours and some IP time in the RF-4. Got silent, and he says, well, I'll get back with you. Well, sure enough, he did about 2 weeks later. And I got a phone call, and I said, well, did you guys decide I could go? And he says, no, we've decided you have too much experience, so you're going to T-38s at Webb. And that ended Vietnam for me. So I got my assignment to Webb Air Force Base in Big Spring, Texas, in T-38s. Came back and had, gosh, almost 3 months leave. And I went down to Webb, checked in, and then went to PIT at Tyndall Air Force Base down in Panama City, Florida, and learned how to be a T-38 IP, and went back to Webb, and I flew, let's see, that was 69, and I flew T-38s there as an instructor until 72. And from there, well, there's some fun stuff from that too. One of the things that we had there at Webb was a bunch of Iranian, Kuwaiti, and I think there was one of the African countries that we had students. And that was where I kind of learned a little bit about the mindset of Mideasterners, if you will. They were a whole different ball of wax. And, I really had fun. I enjoyed, to tell you the truth, I enjoyed being a frontline T-38 instructor. Had a lot of good experiences. Not any, to be honest with you, not any just real bad ones. But then from Webb, I went to Randolph, ATC headquarters, and was T-38 IP and staff officer in the IG. Later, this would have been real early 74. I got a call from a friend that had gone through PIT with me, a guy named Dave Stripling, who was at Beale as the safety officer out there. He called me and says, hey, what are you doing? And I just told him, and he says, I got something really interesting to show you. If you can get a T-38 and come cross country out here, I'll show it to you. Well, I was up for some time anyway, so I got a buddy of mine there, and we got a T-38 and flew out to Beale. Lo and behold, it's the SR-71. So I wandered around and met a few people and tried to find out a little bit more about it, and they were really super secretive about everything that was going on. So fast forward until about June of '74, and I was one of the designated general officer IPs. That, you know, the generals at that point, after that the guy killed himself in the MiG-23, they had come out and said the generals couldn't fly in non-multi-crew airplanes without an IP. So at the time I was working for General Bolt, Jonesy Bolt, and he needed to go out to Mather for a debrief on a IG inspection. And so they called over and told me he'd like me to go with him. So I went and got a T-38 sign and everything. So off we go. And we're flying along at, I don't know, 39,000, something like that. Hadn't said too much. General says, "Dave, what are you going to do?" And I really wasn't sure what the question was. And I said, "Well, about what?" And he says, "Well, are you going with the airlines or what are you going to do?" Well, I said, "Well, General, I really had planned on making the Air Force a career." And he didn't say anything for a minute or so, and he says, "You know you're never going to be a general." To which I was floored, because I was really planning on that and had focused on it. And I said, "Well, why do you say that, sir?" And he says, "Well," he says, and understand, this is '74, the war's done. And he says, "You know, the war's over. And so all the warriors are going to disappear." And he says, "Politicians are taking over." And he says, "You know, you got to understand something about politicians. They'll never hire anybody to be an equal that's smarter than they are." Which I thought was a hell of a compliment, but it really wasn't helping my aspirations any. And he says, "And besides that, I have learned since you've been working with me, there's one thing that you totally do not understand." And I said, "What's that?" And he says, "You don't understand the word no." And I was like, well, okay. So anyway, we cruised out there and we're on our way back. And he says, "So what do you think you might want to do, Dave?" And I said, "Have you ever heard of the SR-71? And he laughed and he says, "Yeah." He says, "I really want to fly it." He says, "Write me up something and we'll see what we can do." So I did, and he wrote me an amazing letter. I was totally floored. Sent it out to Beale, and sure enough, they sent me back an application, and I got assigned out there actually as a staff guy in the wing, because they at that point in time they were only taking 1 or 2 pilots a year. So I was kind of down on the list a little bit because they'd already picked, you know, quite a few guys ahead. But it worked out. I was able to go to Beale and worked there as a wing staff guy for about 1.5 years and was accepted in the program. And that was what I did for the rest of my Air Force career. The application program was really interesting. The qualifications, at that point in time, you had to have 2,500 hours and refueling experience. And that just was the basics. Then you had to have all your OERs. You had to have, like my letter from General Bolt, anything like that, awards and decks and all of that kind of thing. And then if they accepted you to actually interview, I was different because I was based there, and but they would bring them in, and they would put them through I think 3 flights at that time on the T-38 with SR pilots. They put you in the simulator for 2 rides, And then the big bozo on it was you had to go past the astronaut physical. And so we went, and at that time, they were actually, they had moved it, or not moved it, but actually expanded it from Brooks to right there in California, Travis Air Force Base. And so we went down there for 5 days and did all of their physical stuff. And they did stuff that I'd never even heard of. But fortunately, I was able to pass it. So then once they narrowed it down and we were accepted, and started training, the first 3 months were ground school. And I got lined up with a backseater. And the fellow that I was paired with was actually a KC-135 Q navigator out of Beale. And we went through ground school together. And then from there, you go into the simulator. And we went almost all the way through the simulator. And the problem that he had was he could not get his head around the speed. And so he ended up washing out. So I had to wait for the guy behind him to catch up with me so we could start up again in the simulator. The simulator is almost a year's worth. It's amazing. Well over 100 hours, and you've never flown the airplane. And then you get your check ride in the sim, and basically then the pilot gets 5 rides to learn how to fly the SR. And when I say learns how to fly it, the things that were important that are different was refueling and landing. Everything else you could teach, I think, pretty well, and it just took some experience doing it. But so you get 4 rides and then a check ride, and this was all in the B model with an instructor. And then after that, the RSO gets 2 rides with an experienced pilot in the A model, and the pilot goes and flies the A model with an experienced RSO, and you would get 3 rides with them to kind of get yourself up to speed. And then they crewed you together, and you had to get 100 hours, which took a long time, before they would allow you to go operational ready and go TDY. So the training program was extensive, and it was, I don't know, it was really oriented towards, I want to say, independent thinking, because you know you're part of a program, you're part of the Air Force and all of that kind of stuff, but the crews, you were not allowed to fly an operational mission except as a crew. If one of you got sick, they brought somebody else, another crew in to fly. You couldn't fly with somebody else on an operational mission. On training missions, you could, but they were really looking for the crew concept. One of the things that I found interesting right away when I started flying the simulator, the checklist on that thing is about 3 inches thick. There's 64 boldface steps. And it's the only airplane that I know of, and there may be others, but the only one that I know of, they allowed you to put the checklist and everything together any way you wanted to. It didn't have to be in order. It could, just whatever seemed like the most important thing for you at the time, you could do it that way. And so it got to be really interesting. Ed Bethert was the fellow that I ended up going through with. The whole training aspect of flying all of the training missions of it, you fly, 2 hours and 45 minutes was a normal flight, but we flew quite a few two-loopers that were 4 hours in duration. But you can imagine how long that takes when at the most you're going to fly once a week to get 100 hours before you go TDY. So it took up a lot of time. I can't say why, but they decided apparently that I was pretty good at it, and I got upgraded to Stamboard after just about a year and a half in the airplane, and passed up several guys to do that. And I like I say, I don't know why, but so I spent out of all my time in the airplane, I spent about 6 years as a Stamboard instructor and evaluator, and almost 4 years of that as the chief of Stamboard. And so I really got intimately involved in how that all worked. And I didn't really understand what the important things were until I got to teaching guys coming into training. And one of the things I noticed right away was almost everybody, if not everybody, their biggest drawback was they were trying to do things too fast. The speed had them buffaloed to the point where they were just almost like a well-hit four-wood in a tile bathroom, just trying to do stuff. And so it took quite a while to show them that the important thing was not to be in a hurry, it was to be right, because you're only going to get one chance. So you had to make sure that your decisions were correct every time. And to me, that was the hardest part of trying to teach people to fly the airplane. I never had any students that really had any trouble refueling it once they understood it, and got with it. The first flight in the B model for the pilot, you went out and that's all you did for the whole time was hook up, unhook, take gas, unhook, hook up, and then come back. It was all subsonic, and you came back and spent about an hour in the pattern trying to figure out how to land the airplane. And so that was a pretty interesting time. A lot of opportunities to learn a whole lot of things. Then, of course, you started going up to your Mach 3 stuff and regular missions. The SR normal takeoff with a half a fuel load pushing 140,000 pounds, and you light the burner. Basically, the way the thing started off, you lined up on the runway. The engines have an interesting system in them, in that the inlet guide vanes on the compressor are variable, and so when you're at idle, they're in a cambered configuration. And as you push the power up, as it gets up, and it's kind of hard to explain because it's a constant RPM, and you're reading RPM on the instruments and not percentage like you do on most every other jet airplane. But you run it up until the two lights would go out, indicating that the compressor inlet had shifted to axial. Let go of the brakes, push it up to mill, stabilize, check the instruments, min burner, and that's where it gets exciting, because in all the missions, over 800 hours in that airplane, I never ever had burners light at the same time. They always lit asymmetrically, and one of those things lights, the nose goes whipping across, you put it back, and the other one lights, and so you go bam, 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 bam about 3 times and get it lined up, and now you're streaking down the runway, going to max burner, 180 knot rotation speed, 210 knot lift-off speed, and you've only gone, about 3,000 feet down the runway. So the acceleration is amazing. I know the F-15 will do it. I know the F-22 and some of the newer airplanes will do it. But to go ripping down a runway, and that was a 15,000-foot runway at Beale, and by the time the runway, the departure and overrun went under the nose, you were doing 400 knots. And that's pretty quick. So then you climb out about 2 minutes to 25,000 feet and go off with the tanker. So the first time I did that, we were about halfway to the tanker, and I had finally left the runway. It was like, and you know, it wasn't that I wasn't pretty used to go fast airplanes, because both the RF-4 and the T-38 were pretty doggone fast airplanes, but that thing was just like it was like nothing I'd ever experienced. You know, we go out and refueling, and I found, once I figured out exactly where to put the seat and how to look, I had it figured out pretty well, pretty fast. It didn't take very long. And then landing the airplane, the SR landed really similarly to a fairly heavy no-flap landing in the T-38. The whole thing, the visual, everything that you were seeing was pretty similar to that. So I felt like I didn't have much trouble transitioning to it, and some guys did. We had some guys, believe it or not, that Tom Keck is an example. Tom had never flown anything but B-52s, and so that was just real interesting for him, I think, to kind of get up to speed on what was going on. But then the first Mach 3 flight, that was really interesting to me, because then you went through the whole smear. Bob Helt was my primary instructor in the sim. We called him Matter Helt. Matter standing for the miraculous and amazing Dr. Helt, because he had a doctorate, and he was an interesting guy. Anyway, he really did a good job, I thought, of making everything real in the simulator. And the simulator, by the way, other than the fact you didn't have any visual, was really, really good. It flew just like the airplane. And so I didn't feel uncomfortable, the first time going out, other than the fact that I was looking out the window and I could actually see something. And I thought that was really cool. But I never saw an unstart until the fourth mission. And I think that the reason that I found one then was something that I learned later on and used on occasion. The instructor kind of slid in just a little bit of rudder without me really knowing it. And one of the things that the SR was really, really bad about was it had to have straight ahead. That's the reason for the double pitot boom, where it's got the little beta probe on the side. And that was what it was for, was to make sure that you were going straight ahead. Because the inlets could only accept 125 thousandths of a PSI differential without spitting the shock wave out. And so we went through one of those, and it recovered, and we went on and did the rest of our mission. You have to understand that it's not just an engine. Ben Rich designed a system that uses the engine inlet combination. And the way that it operated was, it was just a typical turbojet engine up until about 1.7 Mach. And that's where the bow shock wave, which is the same thing as the stream coming off the bow of a boat, it bends back far enough that it intercepts those cones that are in the inlet. And that bends it back and positions it in the inlet, where a series of, they call bleed traps and doors, slow it down to subsonic and put it into the inlet, into the compressor section of the engine. So that's where the inlet finally, we'll call, starts. And then the faster you go, it starts bypassing the inlet, or the compressor inlet, and goes through 6 different tubes that run the extra air outside of the engine back into the compressor, or back into the afterburner section, and puts it back in with the afterburner fuel. So what that ends up doing is, at Mach 3, about 85% of the thrust for the airplane is coming off the inlet, not the engine. So what happens is, when that inlet has started, as I say, it's providing most of the thrust. So it will only accept a very small differential. If anything, like being a little bit of yaw, some turbulence will do it, temperature change sometimes will do it. If the inlet doesn't respond fast enough, the shock wave gets pushed out of the inlet. And what happens is, you lose that inlet, which is at Mach 3, 35 or 85% of your thrust. So we termed that an unstart. Lockheed termed it an AD, aerodynamic disturbance. The bottom line is, you just lost one engine, basically. So very early on, and a fellow named Bill Weaver was one of the early test pilots, and they were flying a high-speed mission. What they were trying to do was to figure out how they could control trim drag by moving the center of gravity. So they had the center of gravity quite a long ways back. They went into a high bank turn. I think they were around 40 degrees of bank, and the upper inlet unstarted. And with the thrust out of the bottom one pushing them, it just shoved the nose over. The airplane kind of tumbled off to the right, and it was so violent, the airplane just disintegrated, basically. And Bill and his backseater, Jim Swire, never ejected. But both of them, the airplane broke apart around them, and they both came out of the airplane. Unfortunately, Jim hit something on the way out, and it broke his neck, and so he was dead all the way down, even though everything worked, and he came all the way down to the ground in the parachute. Bill has one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard. After he came out of the airplane, he wasn't sure exactly what had happened, except that he knew he hadn't ejected. And one of the first things that happened was the faceplate froze over, and so it was opaque. He had no idea where he was. So his first thought was that he was dead. And he thought about it, and he said, well, this isn't too bad, except I can't see anything, I can't hear anything, I don't know what's going on. Well, he sat there for a while and thought about it, and he started feeling around, and he could feel that he was sitting in the seat. So he started putting two together, and he figured out that his suit was inflated. He was taking breaths, so he must still be okay. But where was he? So he sat there contemplating all of this kind of stuff and trying to figure it out. So he hits about 35,000 feet. And at 34,000, the suit slowly starts to unpressurize. With the objective being around 25,000 feet, it's completely deflated. So he figured out that, well, I must still be here. I must still be okay. So he wrote it on down, and he decided he better take a look outside and see exactly where he was. So he took a couple of big breaths like you do before you go diving into the pool, and he picked up his faceplate. Well, that's when he figured out that it was the faceplate that was frozen over because he could see fine. He looked around a little bit and he could see Jim in his parachute or in his seat, not too far away from him. So he closed it back up and he tried to figure out, because he knew at 15,000 feet he was supposed to get dumped out of the seat. And he was just thinking about trying to look again when in fact that's what happened. He got dumped out of the seat and he went on down, his parachute opened and he came down. This was Lovelock, New Mexico actually was where it's happened. So explaining the unstart again, like I said, at that point in time, that inlet blew out. And because the other one kept going, it was a catastrophic incident. And out of that, they ended up figuring out that if they came up with a system they called the sympathetic shock expulsion system. And so if you get, I think I mentioned it before, 125 thousandths of a PSI differential between the inlets, it'll automatically put both inlets in restart, and that keeps you in the same configuration. And then it goes through its own restart. The doors go open, and I'm talking there about the forward doors, which are computer operated. And they're designed there to keep that pressure at a certain point inside the inlet, and so they'll open and close to let it vent overboard. And so basically, like I said, an unstart means that you have lost one side of your thrust. In that year's time, basically, when I was accumulating my 100 hours to be able to go TDY. So I had not been in the program for that long. They were dedicating a street as a memorial to Kelly, and he had been invited to come up there for the dedication. And so he and Bill Parks came up. Well, there was, as I recall, there was a SAC IG team on the base, and so everybody, the wing commander, everybody was tied up. And so backseater Ed Bethert and myself were assigned to escort Kelly and Bill. And so we ended up being able to spend an entire day one-on-one with those two guys. We just took them anywhere they wanted to go on the base, got to see anything they wanted to see. One of the ones that has always astounded me and just was a great experience. We had gone out to the T hangars to look at one of the airplanes, and we were walking around the airplane, and of course, what do I know about it other than that I can fly it? And we were standing in front of the airplane, and it occurred to me, because I was a history major. I didn't know anything about that aerodynamics and stuff at that point. And I asked him, I said, Kelly, what is that dip in the wingtip that makes the airplane from the front look like a Klingon spaceship from Star Trek? And he got this funny look on his face, and he looked at me and he says, I don't know. And what do you mean you don't know? He says, yeah. He says, we built the airplane as a planform delta wing, just like a 106. And we flew it, and everything was good. And then it went up for the first above Mach 3 mission. And when it came down, it was bent like that. And I'm not sure I'm buying that, but this is Kelly Johnson. He knows what he's talking about. So he says, yeah, so we straightened it out and we sent it back up, and it came back the same way. So I made the decision that we probably better leave it that way. Well, in the meantime, we're kind of looking over, Bill Parks is standing off to the side over there, and he's crossing his legs and doing everything he can to keep from wetting his pants because he's laughing so hard. And Kelly kind of got that twinkle in his eye, and he looked at me and he says, "No," he says, that's called the transverse negative dihedral. And what it does is it helps to control the center of pressure at high speed by diverting the wingtip vortice. I later learned that one of the things that it really helped us with was, since it's a delta wing configuration, there's no flaps. So we flew final at 175 knots plus fuel. And that's going pretty fast with a big airplane like that and trying to land. But because of the way the vortice was diverted downward, you actually start picking up ground effect at about 300 feet. So you are actually, for those people that fly airplanes, you are actually in a flare, slowing down to around 155 knots per touchdown from 300 feet down. And it was pretty interesting. Bill Parks, every time I saw Bill after that, he'd ask me how the Klingon was doing. I had to laugh about that. Everybody that I told that story to was flabbergasted because they really never thought he had that kind of a sense of humor. But I thought he had a great sense of humor, and there were a number of things that he talked about like that, and he'd get that kind of little twinkle in his eye. He is a really interesting guy. But we had an earlier discussion about the YF-12, and that was one of the few things that I never really got the opportunity to talk to Kelly about. We talked about a lot of things with the A-12 and also with the SR-71, but the concept was that Intel was indicating that the Russians had a supersonic bomber. And so at that point in time, basically the 106, 102, and 106 were the main interceptor type airplanes. And neither one of them were capable of getting far enough out quick enough, at least in the authorities' minds, to be able to do anything about it. And so they came up with a concept of the YF-12, and they designed the Phoenix missile to go with that airplane. It was an awesome piece of equipment. Well, obviously at Mach 3, the YF-12 could get a long ways out if they were able to locate on radar or however they were going to find the bombers. The big question that I have is, knowing what it takes to get that airplane off the ground, I think they would be really hard-pressed to get it airborne within an hour. Whereas like a 102 or a 106, they could get it off of the ground, I think, in like 2.5 minutes, some silly thing like that. But that airplane, you can't operate it that way. It's just not feasible. So it has always bothered me, the concept of it, for what they were going to use it for. And like I said, I never got to discuss that with him at all. I don't know what their thoughts were on it, or actually any of the guys that flew it, if it was viable. I think that it's pretty well known that the demise came when the Intel retracted that and found out that no, they do not have a supersonic bomber, so there wasn't a threat. And they canceled the whole thing. They only had 2 airplanes. Anyway, so then, of course, we went on. I got my 100 hours, and we went TDY. And I guess the first really interesting flight that came up was actually my second TDY. And Ed and I were flying what we called a rocket ride out of Kadena. And the way that was done, it was unrefueled. So they would do what was called a yo-yo fuel load on the airplane, because the airplane was restricted to 2.6 Mach unless the fuel tanks were inerted. And the way they did that was they fueled it all the way up till it was full. And then with the nitrogen dewars providing nitrogen to go in on top of the fuel, they would defuel it down to 65,000 pounds, which gave us enough fuel to go and do this mission, which was a one-loop pass through the DMZ in Korea and back to Kadena. And so we were going to fly that, and that was always a challenge mission, because everybody took the challenge from brake release to level off was around 75,000 feet and Mach 3. And so who could get there the quickest? And to the best of my knowledge, Jim Sullivan holds the record, and it's around 12 minutes and 40 seconds. So anyway, Ed and I took off. We sailed on up there and did our pass through the DMZ, and we were coming back, got a hold of the controller and told him we were starting our descent, and we had the descent point that Ed had figured out. I came out of afterburner, and it probably was less than a minute, and the left engine started pretty violently compressor stalling. The EGT was going out of sight, so boldface on that was shut down the engine. And I did that. Ed went through the checklist, and we did all the single engine stuff and got ready to go. We were just continued our descent on down to subsonic, and we were setting up to do a straight-in approach with the GCA there at Kadena. So we were at about 20,000 feet, subsonic, on kind of a modified downwind, and the airplane started banging back and forth. And Ed's comment was, "Dave, don't tell me that's the other engine." I said, "Ed, that's the other engine." And of course he said, "I told you not to tell me that. What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, at this point, I'm going to try to get that other engine started, because I don't know what's going to happen with this engine. And I'd like to have it, even though it's not doing anything for us, at least it's turning over, which is going to provide us with hydraulics, and we're going to be able to fly the airplane." So I went ahead and got the speed up, and we went through the checklist, and the darn engine restarted. But it was still compressor stalling. But keeping it at idle, it wasn't too bad. And the other engine kept doing the same thing. So I said, "I'm going to call the tower, you call mobile." And at that time, it was kind of interesting, because Jim Sullivan was over there on a fact-finding thing. Bob Cunningham was the deck commander, and Tom Keck and Tim Shaw were at mobile. So I said, "Call them up, tell them what's going on, and I'm going to cancel with everything else, and we're going to go visual and land." So he said, "Okay." So I got on the UHF with the tower and told him to cancel all the other stuff, that we were about to turn a modified base leg, and we were in serious jeopardy of losing both engines and might be punching out. So they said, "Well, you got to do what you got to do." Basically that was what they were much more professional about it. But they said, the airport's yours, do what you got to do. And so we made the base leg. We were at about 420 knots. And I started to turn on a final at about 3 miles and trying to get the speed down. And we got it turned, and I was trying to get the gear down, but I couldn't get it down, because we weren't getting as much hydraulic out of the left engine as I thought we were going to. And just about that time, I figured out why, because that engine kind of blew up and seized. So now all we got is the right engine, and it's in idle and not doing a whole lot, but we're really going fast. So I figured we're okay so far. And Ed's back with me, and he said, Mobil's just sitting here watching whatever we need to do. And I said, well, we need to get cleanup checklist because we got to try to get the gear down. And so we went through the alternate gear extension, which is pulling the handle and, the gear handle down and all that kind of stuff. The mains came down and locked, but the nose gear wasn't. And I think part of the problem was we were going too fast. And so we kept slowing down. And one of the things that I kept in mind was, I said, I've got to try to stay as close as I possibly can to trim so that nothing, in case we do lose the other engine or lose our hydraulics, I'm not going to be able to do anything. So you better keep it as close to neutral as we can. So I really worked hard at it. So the nose gear finally came down at about 1.5 miles on final. And simultaneously with the gear coming down, the nose gear coming down, 3 green lights, the right engine seized, just quit. And so I told Ed, I think we're okay at the moment. It's still flying. And he said, just give me the word and I'm gone. And this goes back to what I said earlier about how important the crew coordination and really knowing who that other guy was, because I knew Ed so well that I knew that if I said anything, he was gone and I didn't have to worry about it. And I guess that's just where, I haven't told very many people about it, but I think my religious experience came in, because for some reason, I kept hearing this voice that kept saying, it's okay, keep going. It's okay, keep going. And so I said, well, the airplane's flying, and I'm not trying to do anything. And we were basically at that point at about 230 knots. Now we're over the overrun. So I said, well, let's just keep going. And it was the only time I've ever landed the airplane that I didn't flare. And we touched down. I pulled the drag chute. It was really quiet. And I knew I had 3 brake applications with the emergency brakes. And we stopped about 7,000 feet down the runway and just sat there. And I told Ed, I said, well, we're here, and I think we probably ought to get out of the airplane. Because we hadn't heard anything from anybody, obviously, because we didn't have any electronics. And so we got the canopies open, and a good friend, Master Sergeant Lou Sultan, came driving out with a pickup truck, and he drove the truck under, the back end of the truck underneath the chine. Ed got out of the back seat, and the last I saw him, he was motoring across the inboard of the runway in his spacesuit. And I'm sitting there, and we had spurs that connected to a ball on a cable that would retract your legs if you ejected. And I'll be honest with you, my knees were shaking so hard, I could not get the damn thing unconnected. And it took me, I'm going to say probably 3 or 4 minutes at least to get the spurs off, and then I went ahead and got out of the airplane. And as it turned out, it was very, very fortunate that we were able to save that airplane, because what caused the whole problem was fuel hydraulic pumps. The SR had hydraulic pumps that ran the bleed valves, the inlet guide vanes, the afterburner nozzles, the inboard bleed doors, and a couple of other things, and it was all run by fuel. And this pump is I want to say it's 9 pistons. And what they found out, I didn't know this, incidentally, until last June. I was doing a symposium up at McMinnville, Oregon, and a good friend that had worked for Pratt and Whitney for almost 50 years. He had been the guy that was set to discover what had happened, and I didn't realize that it took him that long. I knew that what had happened was the two hydraulic pumps on that airplane had gone through maintenance at Pratt and Whitney down in Florida, and they'd been rebored and stuff, and somehow the bore in the cylinder was off just enough that there was enough surface abrasion that they disintegrated, and so we lost both hydraulic pumps, and basically then we lost both engines. Come to find out that when they inspected it, they found out that the other airplane at Kadena had one pump on it. 4 airplanes at Beale had 2 of those pumps on it, and one at Mildenhall had 2 pumps on it. So the chances, if we hadn't have got that airplane back and they hadn't have found out what it was that was the problem, I'm pretty sure we would have lost an airplane. They replaced the pumps and everything worked out from then on. But that particular flight was one of the more memorable ones. For that flight, I was awarded the Corn Collegian Trophy and a DFC and a couple other things. But that was one of the more interesting trips in the airplane, to say the least. There was a couple of other missions that we flew. You were looking at kind of interesting missions. We flew one mission, Ed and I, out of Mildenhall, October of 1983. If you remember, they drove the truck bomb into the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon. And Ed and I were TDY at Mildenhall at the time. And I'm not sure exactly why they were so excited about it all, but for some reason, everybody that was important was pretty sure that World War III had just started. But they didn't know what was going on, and I don't know how they couldn't find out, what the whole scenario was. And so they wanted to fly an SR over it. And so Ed and I were up on the barrel, and it was our flight. And what made it really interesting was that we planned it. We had one option of going all the way down around through Gibraltar, going around France and Spain. And the other option was to fly hot over France, which was a big problem. And so we were kind of sitting there getting ready to go, and we weren't sure what we were going to fly. And they finally came down with the word that after a great deal of diplomatic negotiations, France had agreed to allow us to fly supersonic over France. And so that was the option we took. Ed and I took off and refueled and went supersonic, coasted out just about Normandy, went a little bit south of Paris and crossed into the Med at Nice. And so we went down, did the left turn and flew over Beirut, did a big turnaround, came around through Libya, back over Beirut again, went down and refueled, and then flew supersonic back over France. And that was the only time that I know of that the SR was ever authorized to actually be in France. We had several other interesting incidents with it, but that was the only time. And the bottom line of the whole thing was there was nothing else going on except that we found the entire Lebanese Air Force, all 5 A4s were parked on a highway about 10 miles north of town. So that was kind of an interesting mission. And then one other one that gets talked about a lot, we were flying a mission on the Russian sub-pens at Murmansk, which was one of the most important missions that we had, and we basically were working for Synclant doing that. They used our information to update the nuclear order of battle because they could tell whether or not the subs were viable because of where they were. And they had a bunch of stuff that I don't understand as to how they could tell. But this was in the January. So we went smoking up there, and and this time I wasn't flying with Ed. Actually, I was flying with Russ Sapanic. Anyway, we went up there, and the first thing that I noticed that was really interesting compared to normal was we went through 60,000 feet, and we had a contrail that was probably 150 miles long, and it was just still streaming. So the way that mission went, we went around the far north end of Norway and went at an angle, and then before we got to Russia, we made a left-hand turn in a high bank turn and crossed just in international waters, the high bank turn allowing us to see further inland at that altitude. So as we're going towards the turn, I noticed that I've got we're still climbing, but I've got the throttles all the way back to the mid-AB stops. I couldn't go back any further. And yet we're still climbing at 1,500 feet a minute and accelerating. And I mentioned it, and it said, well, we're getting awful high, high being at that point we were going through about 86,000 feet, and still going. We're at that point, I want to say we were at about 3.3. And that was mentioned, and I said, well, except that there's nothing I can do about it. I got everything back as far as it can go, and we're climbing way faster than we're supposed to climb, and it's not slowing down. And the bottom line was that it was 38 degrees below standard. And so you're looking at, your 427 CIT. Heck, we were there sitting at 3.3 Mach, and we were, I don't think we were above 400 on the CIT. So the question, of course, comes, what are you going to do? And I said, well, we got to turn. I think we can make the turn. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and leave it on autopilot with the auto nav engaged to try to keep us on the line, but I'm going to go ahead and manipulate the pitch controls, and I'm going to try to get us, as we start to pick up G's in the turn, I'm going to start to try to let us descend and do kind of a slice type of turn, and hopefully it'll keep us on the line. Well, long story short, it did. We stayed on it, we got the take, and got around the corner, and then we fought the same thing going back to Bodo, trying to get to the tanker. And so the highest we saw was 90,000 feet and 3.49 Mach. And I do know that a couple of guys went faster than that. I know Ken Collins did in one of the A-12s, and I know that Lou Schalk did. They were right at, I think Ken was at 3.5, and Lou said he got up to 3.56. And both of their comments were, we're not going to do that again. So anyway, that was another one of the real interesting missions that we flew. One of Russ's comments that I thought was really hysterical as we were driving along, everything under us was white because it was frozen. And it was really quiet back there, and I was going, you okay back there? What's going on? He says, oh, well, I've been watching this bear down there looking at us. Bear? What? He says, yeah, there's a polar bear down there. And so he was joking with me, of course, but he was looking through the view sight at all, and all he could see was just white. Everything was white. It was frozen. But anyway, we made it back, and everything was good, and so we made Sinkland happy because we got all of his stuff about where the Russian subs were. Let me tell you one other interesting flight, because it was one of the most fun flights I ever had in the airplane. As it turned out, Jerry Glasser was checking out as an IP, and so he was scheduled for his check ride, and I ended up being his evaluator. And as it turned out, it was the 1,000th mission on 956, the B model. This flight was so much fun because Jerry is a super pilot, and he just basically flew the whole thing, from the back seat. And he was doing all kinds of teaching and telling me this and telling me that, and I was just having a great time. For the first time, being able to sit up in the front seat and just look around and go, "This is really cool," and actually being able to do something besides paying attention, to what was going on in the airplane. That whole thing was really, really a fun flight. Back when Mount St. Helens blew, there was 3 volcanoes that year. St. Helens, Krakatoa, and the other one was another island one, and the name of it's escaping me. But all 3 of them were huge, huge eruptions. And so it was almost a year after that, Ed and I were flying a Cuba mission, and it was instead of doing the perimeter, which we did most of the time, it was one of the ones where they were wanting to make a statement. And so we went right down the island, right over Havana, warping along. But what was really interesting about it was we had refueled by Navy New Orleans, and we're doing our Axel, and we were just about at our level off point, which was about 72,000, as I remember. And I'm looking out ahead of me, and I said, "Ed, you're probably not going to believe this. There's clouds above us." And he said, "That's not possible." And everything else was just as clear as could be, but there was a dark cloud, and I couldn't tell for sure, but it looked like it was several thousand feet thick. And it was right in our path. So we talked it over, and he did some calculations, and he says, "Well, it'll burn us a little bit more fuel, but we've got until we get up there. But he says we got enough to make it back to Navy New Orleans, and we'll be okay. Can you get above it?" And I said, "Well, we'll give it a shot." So I kept on climbing instead of leveling off. And I finally got to where I knew I was above the cloud at 82,000 feet. And we flew over it, and it was a dark, real dark gray looking cloud. And it spread for a lot of miles in both directions. And it was about, it actually covered the whole island. So we flew down, we did our turnaround, we came back through and went down and refueled and came back to Beale. Well, we get back to Beale, and they had already been looking at the take and everything. And so I get a call from the wing commander, and he says, "Man, am I glad you didn't fly in that cloud." I said, "Well, why is that?" And he says, "Because that was a volcanic cloud from those volcanoes. And it had traveled twice. This was its 3rd trip around the world from the time it blew up. But all 3 of those volcanoes had grown together, I guess, and this thing was going around the world. And he said, you wouldn't have come out of it. Most of the stories from some of the guys like the British Air 747 that flew into it and lost all 4 engines for a while. I guess flying into a volcanic cloud is not a good idea. And they said they didn't have any idea what would have happened at Mach 3, but I have a feeling that it wouldn't have been good. My last flight, if I recall correctly, was in May of '86. And I had decided to go ahead and retire, and so I was on my way out, and Nevin Cunningham had taken over for me as the chief of stand board, and so they were going to give me my Finney flight, and they said, well, you want to go fly in the B model, or what do you want to do? And I said, I have so many flights in the B model, I just want to go have a nice flight in the A model. And so they set it up, and Ed Beathard had already left to go to SAC, and so I ended up flying with Tim Shaw, and had a really great time. It was just a fun flight. I got to go do a double loop mission and went up to 3.2 just for the heck of it. Came down and was able to do a couple of touch and goes and landed, and had a whole bunch of people there to meet me, and it was just a great flight. It was great weather. Got to see everything. Airplane performed absolutely amazing, and just had a great time. And it was a good way to stop. That was my last Air Force flight. Back before that, kind of leading up to it, they were filming for a television series called Call to Glory. It was about a guy they called Raynor Sarnak, who was supposed to be the commander of the test force at Edwards. And part of it was they had some flying stuff going on with the SR. A guy named Clay Lacy was doing all the filming. And Clay was seniority #1 for United, but he also had Lacy Aviation out of Burbank and Van Nuys. And he did, I guess, a very high percentage of all the air-to-air filming for movies and stuff. And he had a Lear that he was doing all the filming. It's all set up with cameras and all that kind of stuff. And I got tagged because I was no longer on the crew force, so I was his liaison. So I got to fly in the Lear with him on all of the missions we were flying on the SR. And it was really fun. He was really a cool guy. And so after about the third flight, we were down talking with Bernie Smith and I forget who he was flying with at the time, but anyway, we were at PSD and they were getting ready to go fly, and we were going to go film it. And so Clay goes, he says, hey, I just heard you were going to retire. And I said, yeah, I'm getting out. And so he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I have got a clue. I said, I really want to keep flying, which is one of the reasons that I want to retire, because I know that the handwriting's on the wall, and they're getting promoted, and I'm going to end up being a base commander in charge of roads and commodes somewhere, so I'm not going to be flying. And he said, well, he says, I really enjoyed flying with you in the Lear, and you fly it really well. He says, I can offer you a job for about 500 hours a year if you'd be interested. And of course, I said, I'm here. Sign me up. He said, okay, well, we'll talk about it some more. Well, we went and flew our mission, and everything was great. And we came back in the next day, And he comes up to me and he says, Dave, he says, I've been really thinking about it, and I'm not withdrawing the offer for the job, but I just want to let you know that it would be in your best interest to go with one of the majors, because they're starting to hire folks that are your age and retiring, and with all the experience that you got, you're a shoo-in. And I thought about that for a second, and he says, yeah, he says, you know, you can come fly the Lear for me if you want when you're not doing nothing else, because, you know, flying for the airlines is the best part-time job in the world. You're going to work maybe 3 days a week, and the rest of the time you can do whatever you want to do. And I thought, geez, that sounds really like a neat idea. And so I'm thinking he is seniority number one at United. Maybe he'd write me a letter, kind of like General Bolt did to get in the SR, and I could take that to United. And I mentioned it to him, and he says, no, he says, you really don't want to do that. The time frame, to kind of give it a context, United had just had that horrible strike that they had, and they were just foobarred. They didn't know what they were doing. He says, I'm going to recommend American, and he handed me a piece of paper, and it had the chief recruiter and her phone number and everything on it. He says, give her a call. So I did, told her who I was, and she said, I've been waiting for you to call. Can you come down tomorrow? I said, well, I'll have to ask, but I probably can. And she says, well, there'll be a ticket at Sacramento waiting for you, and you can come down to DFW. So I went and asked the wing commander, and he says, yeah, go ahead. So I went down and interviewed, and 6 interviews later, I was hired by American. So I retired and went on leave, and so the day that I retired from the Air Force, I was on my 4th line trip with the American. So it's really better to be lucky than good. I flew just a little while in 727, and then I flew co-pilot on the Super 80, then the DC-10 and the MD-11, and then checked out as captain. I flew captain on the MD-80 for 6 years. Lots of fun. I enjoyed it all the way up until September 11th, 2001. And then it changed. So I was torn, because at that point, age 60 was still a law. And I would turn 60 in May of '02. And so I knew I was going to have to retire. And by the time I did, I was glad I did. American was really, was really good to me. I had a good time, and I really enjoyed it. I have to admit that probably the best job I ever had in my life was flying co-pilot on the DC-10. Your only job was to fly the airplane. That's all you had to do. Because the flight engineer did the pre-flights, he did all of the exterior checks, and the captain did all of the paperwork, and all I had to do was go sit in the cockpit and set the cockpit up to go, and when it was my turn to fly, I flew, and the rest of the time I just talked on the radio. and I was international, and I was senior enough that I could kind of pick and choose, and so when the weather was really great in Europe, I'd fly London, Paris, Frankfurt, Brussels, Madrid. And then when the weather got really bad there, I'd fly St. Martin and Aruba and Honolulu. It's a tough life, man, but somebody's got to do it.
David Peters will now clarify several common misconceptions of the Lockheed SR-71.
Since the airplane retired, have been publicized and are continued to be publicized that are either just flat out not right or misinterpreted and sometimes taken out of context. And one of the first ones that comes to mind is the L.A. speed check story, where it was told that they were flying along at Mach 3 and they heard a Cessna ask the controller how fast they were going, what were their ground speed. And so the controller told him. And some guy came back in an airliner and asked him, and they gave him his ground speed. And then the next one, I think, was an F-15 or an F-16, and he got his ground speed. And so about that time, the SR pilot comes back and says, so what's my ground speed? And the guy told him, supposedly. The issues with it is, number one, we didn't have a radio that you could have heard a Cessna. And all of our controllers were on UHF. And we were on certain special controllers on certain frequencies. We could hear them occasionally talking to somebody else, but we couldn't hear anybody else talking on the radio. The reason that we were on special ones was because at the speed that we were going, we would have been changing frequencies about every 5 minutes or less. And so we had, these guys covered a really big range. The next thing is that at that speed, the readouts on the controller's system didn't go that high, so they wouldn't have known how fast we were going anyway. And the final blow to the whole story is that the first time I ever heard it, Tom Pugh, who was at that time the commander of the det at Palmdale, the test det, told me the story about 7 years before the guy that told the story actually came into the crew force. So basically the whole thing, it's a great story. I enjoy it, you know. The problem with it is, let's do with it what it is, and it's a great story. It kind of illustrates what was going on, but don't make it true, if that makes sense. Yeah, one of the big rumors that goes around all the time is about having to be married to be in the SR program, and I think that somebody made a wild guess, because back in the Mercury astronaut program, those guys had to be married. Not exactly sure what the background was, other than the fact that they claimed psychologically that they were more stable, so on and so forth. What kind of shoots that program down was that Pat Halloran, who later became wing commander and went on to be a 2-star general, was one of the first 5 guys that was selected to fly the SR-71, and he was never married and never has been. So that one kind of goes out the window. Then I guess I can use myself as an example. I was divorced. My backseater was divorced, so neither one of us was married in the program. Terry Pappas was not married. I'm trying to think of some of the other guys that were not married. So there was a lot of people in the program that weren't married. So that never was a requirement. The question of were we flying over the Soviet Union, I think came about because the original concept of the A-12 was to replace the U-2, and as a basically invulnerable component could do the missions that the U-2 was flying over the Soviet Union. And so that thought is out there. However, the reality of it is that after Gary Powers was shot down in the U-2, they had already started development. Kelly had come up with the A-11, which then became the A-12. And before it ever became operational, negotiations were going on between Eisenhower and the Russian premier to get Gary Powers back. And one of the main points that was negotiated was that the U.S. would never overfly Russia again with anything. And so when the A-12 was developed, it ended up going first to Kadena, and the primary objective with it was the Vietnamese War and Korea. Then Kelly had developed the SR-71, and after they had the fly-off, Proud Girl, they decided that the SR-71 was a more viable product because of being two-seat. It had more sensor capability. It had more range because it carried more fuel. And so it became the replacement for the A-12. And all the time that the SR-71 was in use, we were engaged in a project called PARPRO, which is Peacetime Aerial Reconnaissance. And the objective of that is to see everything that you can see without flying over somebody's country. Now, as I said before, yeah, we flew over Cuba. We flew over a lot of countries. But Russia, because of the agreement that Eisenhower made, we never overflew it. We always flew in legally designated by the UN international waters. And you can imagine that flying at 80,000 plus feet with the type of sensors that we had, we could look about 400 miles inland. And if you look at the way Russia's put together, the things that are important in terms of strategic reconnaissance are all viewable from that point. You can see them. You don't have to fly over the country to be able to see it. So the answer to the question is no, we never flew over Russia at all. And everybody says, oh, well, it's still, no. Everything about the SR-71, including the missions it flew and the A-12, was declassified in 2012. So everything's out there. It's not classified. It never happened. You hear a lot about a 3.3 Mach. It comes up because of the flight that they flew from the West Coast to the East Coast to take 972 to the Smithsonian. And they made a big, big deal out of supposedly allowing them to go to 3.3 Mach because we were allowed to do that by discretion of the wing commander. He could say that you could go to 3.3 Mach. 3.2 was our normal high point, high Mach for any kind of missions. I know for a fact that a whole bunch of us went over Mach 3.3. We went over Mach 3.2 for sure. Most of them were involved with the thing that I talked about earlier because of the cold temperatures up over Russia and the Bering Sea in the wintertime. And there were a number of guys that mentioned to me that they had been well above 3.3, some 3.4. I had the one excursion to 3.49. We do know that, and I believe them. I mean, there'd be no reason that Lou or Ken would say they didn't if they did, or didn't, but did if they didn't. But both of them claimed to have gone, Ken to 3.5 and Lou to 3.56, both very momentary. And so, yeah, the airplane is not going to disintegrate or come apart or do any weird stuff above 3.3. Now, having said that, it's fully capable of doing that. Where it runs into trouble is above 3.3 up to about 3.55. It's very shaky in terms of controllability. So if everything is going real well, everything's fine. But I would venture to guess that if you had an unstart, for example, you'd be in deep trouble trying to recover, trying to keep the airplane flying without having some problem. Even with the shock expulsion system, where to keep both inlets together. But no, it will definitely fly above 3.3. To go above 2.6 Mach, you had to have the fuel tanks inerted. And there were two ways to do that. One, and that was one of the main reasons that we refueled immediately after takeoff. Part of the rationale for that was with a lighter load, because of if you look at the SR from the front, it's very skinny. The vertical on it is very low, and so you got that big gear sticking out of there, and it's got to have some place to go. So one of the weakest points of the airplane is the gear, particularly tires, brakes, and wheels. And so they came up with the idea that if we used a partial fuel load, and we normally took off with 45,000 pounds of fuel, that got us down in a gross weight where it was much easier taking off on the airplane because you didn't have so much weight to carry. The second part of that was by going from immediate takeoff out to a tanker, where you could refuel all the way to full tanks, which meant that then with the onboard nitrogen, we had 3 Dewar systems that would put nitrogen into the fuel tanks behind the fuel. As the fuel burned down, it would inert the tanks with liquid or with gaseous oxygen, gaseous nitrogen. And that would allow you to go above 2.6 Mach because of the heat. Above 2.6 Mach, you were starting to push the airframe into a heat position where if it had fumes in the fuel tanks, you had a chance of having an explosion. So that was why they did that. The second way you could do it was, as I explained earlier, on what they called a yo-yo mission. They would fuel the airplane up on the ground to full tanks and then defuel it with the liquid nitrogen Dewars providing nitrogen to inert the tanks, and they defueled it down to 65,000 pounds, which gave us enough fuel to be able to do a pretty good mission, one of which was the rocket ride through the DMZ in Korea out of Kadena. And then we used it quite a bit also out of Mildenhall on that Murmansk mission, because we took off out of Mildenhall with a yo-yo fuel load and went supersonic up to Bodø, Norway for our first refueling. But we had to have the inerted tanks because of the heat to go above 2.6 Mach. Was there an Aurora? And kind of there's a lot of speculation about how all of that stuff went. To do that, I think I need to go back to when I was flying, basically in the mid 80s, and everybody talked about Aurora. What that really was the B-2. Most people didn't know that, but that was the program for the Aurora, was the B-2. And they like they did with so many different kinds of airplanes that were really secret. One of the neatest ones, Bill Parks told me about, because he flew it a lot, was the 117. And what they did with the 117 to keep it really secret was they hid it inside of another really super secret program. And so it just didn't get talked about. But the Aurora at that point, they had a whole bunch of stuff about it, but it was never there. And where it becomes really interesting to the SR-71 program is back when the first Gulf War happened. The airplane had been retired the first time. And John Glenn was a senator from Ohio. He was the chairman of the Senate Select Intelligence Committee. And he got his guys together and they developed a situation paper and presented it that basically proved that the Gulf War would never have happened if the SR had still been flying. Where they were, excuse me, where they were coming from with that was the United States lost complete track of the Iraqi Quanqua Guards Division that were about 10 miles off of the Kuwaiti border. And there was a huge storm, what they call a Habib, and a sandstorm. And the visibility went to zero. And all of a sudden, these guys disappeared, and they had no idea where they were. And so they had established themselves inside Kuwait quite well before things cleared up. The point being that the SR, because of some of the sensor systems that we had, would have found them immediately if they had flown it over the Kuwait. That would have given President Bush, H.W. Bush, would have given him the ammunition to go after Saddam Hussein and tell him to get out of there because we know where you're at. But that didn't happen. Glenn presented the paper, and it was compelling enough that they reinstated the SR program. And so they brought it back, and that's a different discussion. But anyway, from there, Aurora, the reason it came up in that was because Aurora had been canceled at that time, and they used the leftover funding to reinstate the SR. So then you travel on a little bit further down the road, and rumors of the Aurora and everything went on and on for quite some time. Well, then Top Gun Maverick came out, and there had been lots of rumors about the SR-72 and that it was going to be the SR-71 replacement, but it wasn't there, and it wasn't doing anything. And so the guy that developed that movie, he went to Lockheed, and the folks at the Skunk Works said, that's cool, let's do that. And so they built a mock-up, and it's actually made out of wood. It's not, it doesn't fly, it doesn't do any of those things. But they made this really cool mock-up. And if any of you got a chance to see the thing down at Edwards when they had the open house, they had it parked next to the SR-71. And it's just, it's an amazing concept. It's pretty cool. The problem with it is, and the reason it's not flying now is they do not have the engine inlet or engine capability to drive the airplane. So they've never developed it yet, even though they're working on it, but it does not exist at this time. You know, one of the other ones comes up, and it has to do with the same the same thing as the LA Speed Check, and it refers to a book called Sled Driver. And I'm not sure exactly how that came about, but sled driver was a derogatory term that came with the U-2s when they came up from Davis-Monthan to Beale in, I'm going to say, 75. 75 or 76. Anyway, they considered themselves, I think, kind of the bastard stepchild there at Beale because the SR was there. And so they started referring to us as sled drivers. But no self-respecting SR-71 pilot or anybody involved with it ever referred to themselves as a sled driver. So that's kind of a rumor that isn't really something that we want to talk about. Maybe one of the biggest ones. It was told when the SR-71 was retired that it was because of money. And they came out with all kinds of just ridiculously exorbitant amounts of money that it cost to fly the airplane, which were not really true. And what it really boils down to is there was a conflict of interest for personal reasons between the SR-71 program and the Air Force Chief of Staff. And he was on a vendetta to get the program eliminated. Some of the things that occurred as this kind of progressed along was when I was still flying, I want to say it was around 80, 83, somewhere in there. Before that, we always wore orange flight suits, and it was a kind of a status symbol. Well, he took the orange flight suits away and made sure that we were dressed just like everybody else in the Air Force, wearing green flight suits. So that kind of set it off at that point. Anyway, as time went along, the first time the airplane was retired, there was a thing called the Gramm-Rudman Act, and it was about cost saving. And somehow the Air Force got caught up in it. Well, I think the whole military did. And so you'd see things like the wing commander would go get a building authorized and have it all planned out and get the money for it and then cancel it, and that was his cost saving. And so somehow, I'm not sure exactly how they got it worked out that way, but when the airplane was first retired the first time, they used the Gramm-Rudman Act as a cost savings. And then John Glenn did his thing, and they got it back. And they redid 3 airplanes, brought 3 crews in, got everybody ready. The day that they were declared combat ready, Bill Clinton line item vetoed the budget, which later by the Supreme Court was said that was illegal. But they did it anyway. And at that point, everything had been gone. There just wasn't any way to bring the airplane back. But the airplane was not retired because it cost too much. It was retired because very high people at the top, actually, in the Air Force, were embarrassed because the airplane was a lot more spectacular and generated a lot more headlines and importance than their bombers and so on. Part of it that you may have heard about was the debt was directed to fly 972 from Palmdale to Dulles subsonic because they didn't want it to be spectacular. And so a lot of things came out. A lot of people got on board and said, hey, wait a minute, you got the opportunity here to set new world speed records. Let's do that. And I think that they finally got Walsh in a bind enough that he agreed to it. And so they actually finally got him to the point where part of the sortie was allowed to go to 3.3. And so they set a a speed record between Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. But that's one of those rumors that the main thing, the airplane was not retired because of the cost. Another example of that, back when I was flying the airplane and they were talking about retiring it, the K-11 satellite was one of the first spy satellites that were sent up. And interestingly enough, the cost to launch one K-11 at that time would have funded the SR-71 program through the year 2050. So let's don't talk about cost anymore.
After nearly 20,000 hours of flying, David Peters settled in New Mexico and continued his horse business until finally retiring in 2019. He enjoyed a 43-year aviation career. Thank you for watching this unique interview. Please help keep David Peters' memory alive by sharing this episode.